Something is dying in Russia's northwest right now, and it isn't happening on any battlefield you've seen on the news. No explosions, no troops crossing borders, no naval clash in open water. What is happening is quieter, slower, and in strategic terms, far more damaging than any single military defeat Russia has suffered since this war began. Two of the most critical arteries keeping Russia connected to the world are being severed simultaneously, and Moscow has no answer for either one. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand Russia's geography in a way that most Western analysts still haven't fully grasped. The first artery is a place most people couldn't find on a map: Kaliningrad. It is a fragment of Russian territory physically detached from mainland Russia, a small exclave sitting on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, surrounded on land entirely by NATO members. Lithuania to the north and east, Poland to the south, the Baltic Sea to the west. It is Russian land with no land connection to Russia that doesn't pass directly through a NATO country. This was always Russia's most exposed strategic outpost. During the Soviet era, that vulnerability was manageable because the surrounding land was either Soviet or compliant. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. The Baltic states reclaimed their independence. Lithuania and its neighbors joined NATO. And suddenly Kaliningrad went from being a fortress buried inside friendly territory to being a pressure point encircled by an alliance that Russia now considers an existential adversary. The military infrastructure Russia built there over decades, Iskander ballistic missiles capable of striking targets across a major arc of Central Europe, S-400 air defense systems threatening NATO air operations across the Baltic region, electronic warfare arrays monitoring communications across a wide radius. All of it was built on the assumption that the logistical artery running through Lithuania would stay open. That assumption is now broken. And if you think that's the worst of it, keep watching, because the second artery makes this picture dramatically worse. Drop a comment right now if you're just learning about Kaliningrad for the first time. You are not alone, and understanding this changes everything about how you read the Russia-Ukraine war. Before we get to the second crisis, you need to understand how the first one reached this point, because the mechanism is surgical in a way that reveals exactly how much strategic pressure can be applied without firing a single shot. Lithuania, as the primary land transit state between mainland Russia and Kaliningrad, had maintained a rail freight transit agreement that allowed Russian cargo to cross its territory under specific conditions. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Lithuania began restricting the transit of sanctioned goods. Russia erupted, calling it an act of aggression, demanding full restoration of transit rights, threatening consequences. The standoff was temporarily managed, but the logic of escalation was already locked in. Since then, the combination of tightened sanctions, Lithuania's sovereign decisions about what crosses its land, and the complete collapse of Russia-NATO relations has produced a crisis where the rail freight corridor that Kaliningrad depends on for the bulk of its civilian and military survival is no longer functioning at the volume the exclave requires. Food, fuel, industrial goods, military components. The pipeline is choked. The backup route is sea transit through the Baltic. But that path has its own set of dangers that have become dramatically more serious. Sweden and Finland, both now NATO members following Russia's invasion, have transformed the Baltic Sea's strategic character. Every coastline bordering the Baltic, except Russia's thin northwestern strip and the Kaliningrad enclave, now belongs to a NATO member state. The Danish Straits, the narrow passages linking the Baltic to the North Sea and the open ocean, are watched. Russia's room to maneuver its supply shipping in the Baltic has been strangled by a naval environment that NATO now effectively dominates. What this means in practice is that Kaliningrad is experiencing a slow strangulation, not a sudden collapse, a daily tightening of the margin, a daily reduction of the flexibility available to the forces stationed there. And here is the trap that Russian strategic planning never properly solved. The options available to reverse this are each individually catastrophic. Forcing open the land corridor through Lithuania means military action against a NATO member. Activating Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, triggering a response Russia cannot survive given its ongoing hemorrhage in Ukraine. Building a secure sea supply line requires Baltic naval dominance Russia no longer has. Negotiating a diplomatic reopening requires concessions the Kremlin has shown no willingness to make and would need to be convincing enough to persuade Lithuania to cooperate in a geopolitical environment that makes such cooperation effectively unimaginable. The outpost built to project Russian power westward is now consuming resources it cannot replace. And every day that continues, the military systems there that were designed to deter NATO degrade a fraction further. Now let's talk about the second artery, and this one hits at the very heart of Russia's economic identity. St. Petersburg, Russia's second city, founded by Peter the Great specifically to give Russia a window onto European civilization, European commerce, and the wider world. For over 3 centuries, it served that function. It was Russia's most European city in character, in economic orientation, in the density of its connections to Western markets and institutions, and its port complex was the crown of that role, handling a massive share of Russia's commerce with Europe and the wider global economy. Because what has happened to St. Petersburg's port since 2022 is the story of a commercial infrastructure collapsing in slow motion as every pillar supporting it is removed one by one. The major container shipping lines, the companies whose vessels carry the bulk of global containerized trade, suspended their Russian services. Not in all cases because governments ordered them to, but because the business calculation made continuation commercially suicidal. Secondary sanctions exposure, the withdrawal of marine insurance, reputational damage, the legal complexity of every single cargo movement in a sanctions environment that treated each shipment as a potential liability. The insurance dimension of this deserves specific focus because it operates beneath the surface in ways most commentary misses entirely. Marine insurance is not optional infrastructure. It is the mechanism through which the financial risk of operating ships worth hundreds of millions of dollars is distributed across a system that makes the entire global shipping industry function. Without it, ships cannot operate in standard commercial markets. The Lloyd's market and the network of P&I clubs that provide the bulk of marine insurance coverage became effectively closed for Russia-connected operations, not because of a blanket formal prohibition in every case, but because the sanctions exposure, the reputational risk, and the complexity of covering Russia-linked cargo made it commercially toxic to every underwriter who ran the numbers. Russia built a shadow fleet to compensate, aging vessels operating outside Western insurance frameworks, registered through states willing to ignore serious inspection requirements. For crude oil exports, where the cargo is interchangeable and Asian buyers were prepared to absorb the additional risk, this workaround functioned in rough form. For the containerized and general cargo commerce that flows through St. Petersburg, where each shipment involves multiple parties, complex transit arrangements, and the need for secure onward connections, the shadow fleet model breaks down. The result has been a steady draining of commercial traffic through a port that was once one of Europe's significant freight gateways. Berths that held ships from the world's major lines now sit empty or handle a fraction of their former volume. The logistics infrastructure built to process cargo that no longer arrives operates at shrinking capacity. Port workers, freight operators, customs officials, trucking companies, all of them are absorbing the damage of a structural shift that shows no sign of reversing. And the strategic consequences of this reach well beyond the economic pain visible in St. Petersburg itself. Russia's import capacity through its Baltic gateway has been badly damaged at precisely the moment when the country most needs to import components, materials, and finished goods that its own industrial base cannot produce, including parts that its military-industrial complex depends on. Here is where both crises converge into something larger than either of them individually. Look at the map. Kaliningrad is Russia's western Baltic anchor, being strangled from its land link. St. Petersburg is Russia's eastern Baltic anchor, being strangled by the collapse of the commercial infrastructure that gave the port its reason to exist. Russia is losing both ends of its Baltic access simultaneously. This is not coincidence. The strategic logic of exploiting Russia's geographic vulnerabilities in its northwest has been understood by NATO strategists and the governments of the Baltic states for years. The entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO, two countries that had maintained studied neutrality for decades and whose membership dramatically transformed the entire strategic map of the Baltic, created the conditions in which applying this pressure became genuinely feasible. Finland's membership in particular rewrote the calculus in ways that are still being absorbed. Finland maintained serious military readiness against Russia throughout the post-war era. It has a large, well-trained reserve force. It shares a long land border with Russia in the northwest. Its membership in NATO means that the entire northern flank of Russia's European land is now bordered by alliance members. The strategic depth Russia believed it had in the northwest, the buffer space, the assumption that the northern approaches to St. Petersburg were not directly threatened, has disappeared. The Russian military has responded by repositioning forces toward the Finnish border and the Leningrad Oblast, boosting air defense coverage in the northwest, increasing activity near Murmansk, where the Northern Fleet and nuclear submarine infrastructure are concentrated. These responses reveal the fear driving them, and they impose a cost that compounds the larger problem. Every unit repositioned to the northwest is a unit unavailable for operations in Ukraine. Every air defense system moved to cover the northern approaches is a system no longer protecting Russian cities from Ukrainian drone and missile strikes. The strategic overstretch that Russia's critics warned about is becoming visible in real time as the country attempts to cover an expanding perimeter of threats with military resources already under extreme pressure from the active conflict. Russia's backup routes, through Arctic ports, through Belarusian rail connections, through Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, provide partial relief but not replacement. The Arctic routes are constrained by ice conditions for significant portions of the year and by the thin port and logistics infrastructure that exists along the path. The Belarusian option adds political dependency on a relationship that, while currently intact, is not unconditionally guaranteed. The Black Sea routes operate in an environment where Ukrainian operations have demonstrated a persistent capacity to reach targets across a wide arc of naval and coastal geography. There is no clean workaround. There is no route that replaces what is being lost without incurring serious costs and vulnerabilities of its own. The political dimension of what is happening in St. Petersburg adds a pressure layer the Kremlin would prefer to keep invisible. St. Petersburg has historically been the most politically restive of Russia's major cities. Its educated population, its fierce local identity, its tradition of skepticism toward concentrated central power, these are not recent phenomena. The economic damage being caused by the port shutdown and the broader severing of Western commercial connections is feeding a sense of grievance that is not expressing itself through organized political opposition, the tools for suppressing that still function, but that is present in the texture of daily life in ways that any serious government cannot afford to ignore. The public response from Moscow has followed the established template: denial, minimization, the insistence that backup routes are being developed and that Western restrictions are illegal and temporary. Privately, the assessments circulating inside the government tell a different story about the scale of the problem and the limits of the available responses. What Russia is confronting in the Northwest is not a logistical problem awaiting a technical solution. It is the eruption of a structural vulnerability that has been present for decades and is now being actively and precisely exploited by a combination of formal sanctions, private commercial decisions made by global companies responding rationally to the sanctions environment, and the transformed strategic geography created by NATO's expansion across the Baltic region. The countries driving this pressure, the Baltic states, Finland, Sweden, the broader alliance coordinating the sanctions architecture, have sustained it with a coherence and a duration that Russian strategic planning appears to have genuinely failed to anticipate. The belief within Russian strategic circles that Western resolve would crack, that economic self-interest would eventually fracture the alliance's unity, that the costs of supporting Ukraine would eventually exceed the political will to continue, that belief has not been validated. It has been contradicted. The states most directly in Russia's geographic neighborhood, the ones with the most direct experience of what Russian power politics produces, have hardened rather than softened. What is unfolding in the Northwest is not the decisive moment of this conflict. Russia will not collapse because the Kaliningrad land corridor is restricted or because St. Petersburg's port moves a fraction of its former cargo volume. These are not fatal blows, they are pressures. But they stack, they compound, they interact with the pressures being applied in Ukraine, in technology supply chains, in the financial architecture that Russian institutions depend on. And the combined weight of all of these pressures, sustained daily, is what determines whether Russia's strategic position stabilizes or continues to decay. The current trajectory does not point toward stabilization. It points toward continued erosion at a pace that Moscow's public communications consistently understate, and that the decisions of outside actors relentlessly work to accelerate. The Northwest is not background noise to the main war in Ukraine. It is a second theater of strategic attrition that is consuming Russian resources, narrowing Russian options, and steadily weakening Russia's overall position in ways that interact with and amplify every other pressure the country is under. Moscow is losing its Baltic access. And unlike the losses it has absorbed on the battlefield in Ukraine, this loss is geographic, structural, and rooted in sovereign decisions made by independent states acting entirely within their legal rights. Decisions that are therefore far harder to reverse than any setback on a conventional front line. The corridor is cut, the port is closing, the Baltic Sea that Russia once patrolled as a contested space is now a NATO-dominated naval environment. The Finnish border that was once a zone of careful neutrality is now a NATO edge. None of this was inevitable. All of it is the direct consequence of the strategic calculation that sent Russian forces into Ukraine in February 2022. The Russia that emerges from this era, whenever it ends and on whatever terms, will not recover the strategic position in the Northwest it spent 3 centuries constructing. That position is gone. And the silence from Moscow, the absence of any credible countermove, any real reversal, any demonstration that the pressure can be stopped, that silence is the most honest assessment of Russia's real strategic condition that the Kremlin will ever accidentally provide. We update this analysis daily as the situation develops. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening beyond the battlefield headlines, share it with one person who needs to understand this conflict at this level. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the kind of analysis we do every single day.